November 1944. A forest clearing somewhere in eastern France. The shooting had stopped. Smoke drifted through the shattered trees. The ground was torn by shell craters and littered with broken equipment, spent shell casings, and bodies, some moving, most not. 20-year-old Corporal Hans Dietrich lay in the mud, his leg burning with pain, his rifle gone, his hands trembling. Around him, what remained of his unit, 12 men that morning, now perhaps 5, waited in silence for what would come next. They had no ammunition, no way to fight, no way to run. The Americans were all around them, calling out in English, voices echoing between the trees. Hans had been told what to expect if he surrendered. The propaganda posters back home showed Americans as monsters, torturers who murdered prisoners, savages who respected nothing. He had believed it. Everyone had believed it. And now, as American soldiers emerged from the smoke with rifles raised, Hans closed his eyes and waited to die. But death didn't come. Instead, a voice spoke in broken German. "Hands up. You're prisoners now. We won't hurt you." Hans opened his eyes. An American soldier stood over him, young like Hans, maybe even younger, with dirt on his face and exhaustion in his eyes. The American lowered his rifle and extended his hand. "Can you walk?" he asked. Hans stared at the hand, unable to move, unable to comprehend. The enemy was offering help. That moment, that single, impossible gesture, would haunt Hans Dietrich for the rest of his life. Because in that clearing, on that November day, everything he had been taught about the enemy, about the war, about the nature of humanity itself, shattered like glass. And what replaced it was something he had never expected to find on a battlefield: mercy. This is the story of what happened next. It's not a story of battles won or strategies executed. It's a story of how compassion survived in the worst place imaginable, how small acts of kindness became more powerful than any weapon, and how one German soldier discovered that the line between enemy and human was far thinner than anyone had told him. Hans Dietrich had been a soldier for 2 years, but he had been prepared for war his entire life. Born in 1924 in a small town outside Munich, Hans grew up in the shadow of Germany's humiliation after World War I. His childhood was marked by economic collapse, political chaos, and the rise of a movement that promised to restore German pride. He joined the Hitler Youth at 10, as all boys did. He marched. He sang. He learned that Germany had been betrayed, that enemies surrounded the nation, and that only strength and unity could save it. By the time Hans turned 18 in 1942, joining the Wehrmacht seemed natural, almost inevitable. His older brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. His father, a veteran of the First War, rarely spoke but wore his medals with quiet pride. Hans wanted to serve. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to be part of something larger than himself, even if he didn't fully understand what that something was. Training was harsh but straightforward. Hans learned to shoot, to march, to obey orders without question. He was taught that the war was about survival, Germany against a world determined to destroy it. The Soviets were Bolshevik barbarians. The British were imperial deceivers. And the Americans, those late arrivals who had tipped the balance, were portrayed as a mongrel nation of gangsters and weaklings who would crumble once they faced real soldiers. Hans believed what he was told because he had no reason not to. The propaganda was everywhere, in newspapers, on radio, in films. And it was reinforced by reality. Germany had conquered most of Europe. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible. For a young man with limited education and no experience beyond his village, questioning the narrative was impossible. You believed, or you were a traitor. There was no middle ground. By autumn 1944, the situation had changed dramatically. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June. Paris had fallen in August. American and British forces were pushing toward the German border, grinding through fortified positions, destroying everything that resisted. Hans's unit, the 276th Infantry Division, had been transferred west from garrison duty to help slow the Allied advance. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly demoralized. Officers still spoke of victory, but the men knew better. They were losing. Slowly. Inevitably. The battle that would change Hans's life began at dawn on November 18th. His unit was defending a forest position near the French-German border. The Americans attacked with overwhelming force, artillery first, shelling the German trenches for an hour, then infantry advancing behind tanks. Hans and his comrades fought desperately, firing until their ammunition ran low, then lower, then gone. The forest became a nightmare of noise and smoke and death. Men Hans had known for months fell around him, torn apart by bullets and shell fragments. When a mortar round exploded near his position, Hans was thrown backward. He felt a burning sensation in his left leg, but no immediate pain. Adrenaline kept it at bay. He tried to stand but couldn't. His leg wouldn't support weight. Looking down, he saw blood soaking through his trousers and a piece of metal embedded in his thigh. He tried to crawl toward cover, but couldn't move far. The pain arrived then, sudden and overwhelming, and he collapsed face down in the mud. Time became strange. Minutes felt like hours. Hans drifted in and out of consciousness, hearing gunfire gradually diminish, voices calling out in German and English, boots squelching in mud nearby. When he opened his eyes, American soldiers were moving through the clearing, checking bodies, securing prisoners. Hans lay still, hoping they wouldn't notice him, terrified of what would happen if they did. If you're moved by forgotten stories of humanity surviving the darkest moments, subscribe to Retro Files and discover the acts of compassion that history nearly erased. But they did notice. Boots stopped beside him. A voice spoke in English. Hans didn't move, didn't look up, barely breathed. Then hands touched his shoulder, gently rolling him onto his back. Hans opened his eyes and saw an American soldier kneeling beside him. A medic, identified by the red cross on his helmet and armband. The medic was young, perhaps Hans's age, with a serious expression and careful hands. "Easy," the medic said in German, the accent terrible but the meaning clear. "I help." He opened his medical bag and began examining Hans's leg. Hans watched in disbelief as the medic carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric, exposing the wound. The metal fragment was embedded deep. The medic pulled out a morphine syringe, showed it to Hans, and injected it into his arm. Within moments, the pain began to recede, replaced by a strange floating sensation. The medic worked quickly, extracting the metal fragment with tweezers, cleaning the wound with disinfectant that burned, then wrapping it tightly with bandages. Throughout the process, he spoke soothingly in broken German. "Almost done. You'll be okay. Stay still." Hans couldn't reconcile what was happening. This was the enemy. This was one of the monsters from the propaganda posters. Yet here he was, kneeling in the mud, carefully treating a wound he had no obligation to treat, showing concern for a man who had been trying to kill him an hour earlier. When the medic finished, he helped Hans sit up and offered him a canteen of water. Hans drank gratefully, his throat raw from smoke and fear. The medic then pulled out a chocolate bar, broke it in half, and gave Hans a piece. "Eat," he said simply. Hans ate, the sweetness strange and wonderful after weeks of iron rations. The medic smiled slightly, then moved on to the next wounded soldier, a German like Hans, bleeding from a shoulder wound, receiving the same careful treatment. Hans was carried on a stretcher by 2 American soldiers to a collection point where wounded were being gathered, German and American alike. The stretcher bearers moved carefully, trying not to jostle him, occasionally speaking to him in English he didn't understand, but in tones that were unmistakably reassuring. They set him down gently under a makeshift shelter constructed from camouflage netting and tree branches. Around him lay perhaps 24 wounded men. Some wore American uniforms. Some more German. The medics moved between them without distinction, treating whoever needed treatment most urgently. Hans watched in stunned silence. A German soldier with a bandaged head lay beside an American with his arm in a sling. Across from them, a German corporal with a chest wound received the same careful attention as an American sergeant with a shattered leg. The medics worked methodically, applying bandages, administering morphine, starting plasma transfusions when necessary. There was no anger in their faces, no hatred, just exhaustion and concentration. They were saving lives. That was all that mattered. An American officer walked through the aid station, checking on the wounded. He stopped beside Hans and spoke in surprisingly good German. "How are you feeling, soldier?" Hans stared up at him, unable to formulate words. The officer smiled slightly. "You'll be all right. The wound isn't too bad. We'll get you to a field hospital, then to a POW camp. You'll be safe there. The war is over for you." He paused, then added, "You're lucky. You'll survive this." He moved on before Hans could respond. Lucky. The word echoed in Hans's mind. He had been shot, captured, and his entire world had collapsed. Yet the American officer was right. He would survive. How many of his friends from training, from his unit, from his village, were already dead? His older brother, his childhood friend Carl, his lieutenant, who had died in the mornings. Hours passed. The morphine wore off and pain returned, but it was manageable. Medics changed his bandages and gave him more painkillers. Someone brought soup, thin, watery, but warm and better than anything Hans had eaten in weeks. An American soldier offered him a cigarette. Hans accepted, his hands shaking slightly as he smoked. The American sat beside him for a few minutes, not speaking, just sharing the silence. Before he left, he pressed several more cigarettes into Hans's hand and nodded. Hans nodded back. No words were needed. As evening approached, the wounded were loaded onto trucks for transport to a field hospital farther behind the lines. Hans was lifted carefully onto a truck bed where wounded American soldiers already lay on stretchers. Nobody objected to his presence. One American, his leg wrapped in heavy bandages, caught Hans's eye and offered a weary smile. Hans tried to smile back. They were enemies. They had been trying to kill each other hours ago. Now they were just two wounded men sharing the back of a truck, both wondering if they would see home again. The field hospital was in a commandeered French farmhouse, its barn converted into a surgical ward. Inside, kerosene lamps cast flickering light across rows of cots. The smell was overwhelming: disinfectant, blood, sweat, and something else Hans couldn't identify but instinctively feared. Doctors and nurses moved purposefully between patients, their white coats spotted with blood. Hans was examined by a doctor who spoke no German but whose hands were gentle and professional. The doctor removed Hans's bandages, studied the wound, nodded in satisfaction, and rebandaged it with fresh gauze. A nurse, a woman, which shocked Hans. He had never seen female medical personnel so close to the front, brought him water and more soup. She smiled at him, a tired but genuine smile, and spoke in French-accented English. Hans didn't understand the words, but he understood the kindness. To explore more profound stories of humanity triumphing over hatred in history's darkest hours, subscribe to Retro Files and witness the moments that prove compassion never truly dies. That night, lying on a cot in a barn in occupied France, surrounded by wounded enemies who treated him as if he belonged, Hans began to question everything. The propaganda had been so certain, so absolute. Americans were monsters. The enemy was evil. Surrender meant torture and death. Yet here he was, wounded and vulnerable, receiving care that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had provided its own soldiers in months. The Americans had antibiotics, plasma, morphine. They had food, blankets, and medical supplies in abundance. They had nurses who smiled and doctors who worked through the night, saving German lives as readily as American ones. What had he been fighting for? What had his brother died for? What justified any of this if the enemy his leaders had demonized turned out to be more humane than his own side? The questions circled in Hans's mind, disturbing and persistent. He had no answers. He wasn't sure he wanted answers. Answers would mean accepting that everything he had believed was a lie. He slept fitfully, waking periodically to the sounds of groaning men, hurried footsteps, and urgent whispered conversations. Once, he woke to see a chaplain, identifiable by his insignia and manner, kneeling beside a cot across the aisle, praying over a dying soldier. Hans couldn't tell if the soldier was American or German. The chaplain prayed with equal solemnity regardless. When the soldier died, the chaplain closed his eyes gently, made the sign of the cross, and sat for a moment in silence before moving to the next bed. Hans watched, unable to look away. The chaplain noticed him watching and came over. "Do you speak English?" the chaplain asked in German, his accent marking him as American but his German fluent. Hans shook his head. "A little. Not much." The chaplain sat on the edge of the cot. "You're going to be all right," he said simply. "The wound will heal. You'll walk again." "Why?" Hans asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Why do you help us? We are your enemies." The chaplain was quiet for a moment. "You are men," he said finally. "That's enough." He placed a hand on Hans's shoulder briefly, then stood and moved on to the next patient. 3 days later, Hans was transferred to a more permanent hospital farther from the front lines. The journey was uncomfortable but careful. Trucks with springs that absorbed road bumps, drivers who avoided potholes, stops for water and rest. Hans traveled with a dozen other wounded German prisoners, all receiving the same treatment. Some were bitter, convinced this kindness was a trick or propaganda. Others, like Hans, were simply confused and quietly grateful. The hospital was in a converted school building in a French town that had been liberated months earlier. German prisoners occupied one wing, American casualties another, but the medical staff moved freely between both, providing equal care. Hans was assigned a bed in a ward with 20 other Germans, most with wounds more serious than his. Some would recover fully. Others would lose limbs or live with permanent disabilities. All were alive because the Americans had chosen to save them. Recovery was slow. Hans's leg healed gradually, the pain diminishing day by day. Physical recovery was easier than mental recovery. He had time now, too much time, to think. He observed the Americans constantly, trying to understand them. They were not monsters. They were ordinary men doing an unpleasant job. They laughed. They complained. They wrote letters home and looked at photographs of sweethearts and children. They got tired, scared, angry, and sad. They were human in all the ways Hans was human. One nurse in particular caught Hans's attention. She was young, perhaps 25, with kind eyes and patient hands. She spoke to the German prisoners in careful, simple English, using gestures to communicate what words couldn't convey. She never showed fear or disgust, even when treating the most severe wounds. Hans watched her hum softly while changing bandages, a wordless tune that seemed to calm the most distressed patients. She treated dying men, German and American, with identical tenderness, holding their hands and speaking softly as they faded away. Hans asked another German prisoner, an older man who spoke some English, who she was. "Her name is Helen," the man said. "She's from Minnesota. She told me she became a nurse because her brother died in North Africa. She wanted to save other women's brothers." He paused. Even German brothers, apparently. This revelation stunned Hans. She had lost family to German soldiers, yet here she was, caring for Germans with no trace of hatred or revenge. How was such forgiveness possible? What kind of person could set aside personal grief to help their enemies? Hans had no framework for understanding this. German propaganda had told him Americans were weak, decadent, lacking the iron will necessary for modern war. But this woman showed a strength Hans had never encountered, the strength to maintain humanity when everything around her denied it. As weeks passed, Hans began learning English from the other prisoners who spoke it. He practiced simple phrases, greeting the nurses and doctors, thanking them for treatment. The Americans seemed pleased by these efforts, responding encouragingly. One doctor gave Hans a small English-German dictionary, telling him it would help pass the time. Hans studied it obsessively, driven by a need to understand these people who had saved his life. In early December, Hans and other recovering prisoners were informed they would be transferred to a permanent POW camp. The news brought mixed emotions. The hospital had become familiar, even comfortable. The staff had been kind. The food, while simple, was adequate. But Hans knew this was temporary. Eventually, he would have to face whatever came next. The night before the transfer, Nurse Helen stopped by Hans's bed. She smiled and handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," she said in slow, clear English. "For the journey." Hans opened it. Inside were chocolate bars, cigarettes, a bar of soap, and a small notebook with a pencil. Hans looked up at her, overwhelmed. "Thank you," he said in careful English. "Thank you very much." She patted his shoulder. "You take care," she said. "You go home someday. You have good life." She moved on to the next bed, distributing similar packages to other prisoners. Hans watched her go, clutching the notebook. That night, he wrote his first diary entry in years. Awkward, simple words in German describing what had happened since his capture. He wrote about the medic who had saved him, the doctor who had treated him, the chaplain who had prayed for him, and Nurse Helen who had shown him that compassion could survive even war. The next morning, Hans and 30 other German prisoners were loaded onto trucks for transport to the POW camp. As they drove through the French countryside, Hans looked out at the passing scenery. Farmland recovering from war, villages beginning to rebuild, civilians going about their lives. The world continued despite everything. People survived. They rebuilt. They forgave, or at least they tried to forgive. Hans thought about home, his mother and sister, his surviving friends, his village. What would they think if he told them about this? Would they believe him? Or would they accuse him of being brainwashed by enemy propaganda? He wasn't sure anymore what was propaganda and what was truth. All he knew was that he had expected monsters and found humans. He had expected cruelty and received mercy. And that simple fact had shaken the foundation of everything he had been taught to believe. The POW camp was located in Belgium, a sprawling compound of barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Thousands of German prisoners lived there, captured in various stages of the war's final year. When Hans arrived in December 1944, the camp was overcrowded but organized. Prisoners received regular meals, medical care when needed, and treatment that, while not luxurious, met the standards of the Geneva Convention. For soldiers who had spent months in crumbling trenches eating iron rations and sleeping in mud, the conditions seemed almost comfortable. Hans was assigned to a barracks with 50 other men. Some were bitter and defiant, clinging to Nazi ideology and insisting Germany would still win. Others were relieved to be out of the fighting, grateful to be alive and relatively safe. A few, like Hans, were deeply confused, caught between what they had been taught and what they had experienced. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. The propaganda had promised that capture meant torture and death. Yet here they were, fed regularly, housed adequately, and treated with basic human dignity. Life in the camp fell into routine. Prisoners worked, clearing rubble, repairing roads, helping with reconstruction in nearby towns. The work was supervised but not harsh. Guards maintained discipline but rarely abused their authority. Prisoners received mail from home, though censored and irregular. They organized entertainment, amateur theater productions, musical performances, educational classes. Some learned English. Others studied trades. Everyone waited for the war to end. Hans continued his diary, writing in the notebook Nurse Helen had given him. He documented daily life, but also his evolving thoughts about the war, the enemy, and what he had witnessed. His early entries were tentative, questioning. Later entries grew more certain. He wrote about the medic who had treated his wound, the chaplain who had prayed regardless of nationality, Nurse Helen who had cared for him despite losing her own brother. He wrote that these acts of mercy had saved not just his life, but something deeper, his faith that humanity could survive even the worst circumstances. Other prisoners noticed his writing. Some were curious. Others were suspicious. One evening, an older prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Friedrich, sat beside Hans during the evening meal. "You write a lot," Friedrich observed. "What about?" Hans hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than evasion. "About what happened after I was captured. How the Americans treated us." Friedrich nodded slowly. "You were surprised? Weren't you?" Friedrich smiled sadly. "I stopped being surprised years ago. I was captured in North Africa in '43. British treated us decently. I expected the same from the Americans." He paused. "What surprises me is how long it took for the rest of you to realize the propaganda was lies. You never believed it. I believed what I could verify with my own eyes. Everything else was just words." Friedrich looked around the mess hall at the hundreds of prisoners eating, talking, existing in relative normalcy despite being captives. "Look at this. We're fed. We're safe. We're treated like human beings. If the Americans were the monsters Berlin claimed, would any of us be alive?" Hans had no answer, but Friedrich's words resonated. The evidence was everywhere, impossible to deny once you allowed yourself to see it. The guards who were firm but fair. The medical staff who treated German prisoners as carefully as they treated their own wounded. The Red Cross representatives who inspected the camp regularly, ensuring compliance with international law. The camp commander who allowed prisoners to elect representatives and voice concerns. None of this matched the propaganda's portrait of a barbaric enemy bent on Germany's destruction. For more stories that reveal humanity's capacity for compassion even in history's darkest moments, subscribe to Retro Files and discover the truths that propaganda tried to hide. Winter turned to spring. The war continued, but with increasing finality. News filtered into the camp. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead. In early May 1945, word came that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. The prisoners' reactions varied wildly. Some wept with relief. Others sat in stunned silence. A few remained defiant, insisting the surrender was temporary, that Germany would rise again. Most simply felt exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually drained by years of war that had ended in total defeat. Hans felt something he didn't expect: gratitude. He was alive. His mother and sister had survived the war. He had received a letter confirming this just weeks earlier. He had been captured before the worst of the fighting, spared the final desperate battles. And he had learned something that would shape the rest of his life: that enemies could show mercy, that compassion could survive hatred, and that humanity persisted even when everything conspired to destroy it. The months after the war ended were strange. Prisoners remained in camps while authorities determined how to process millions of German POWs. Some were released quickly if they could prove they hadn't been Nazi Party members or committed war crimes. Others waited months or years. Hans was fortunate. His youth, his low rank, and his clean record meant he was processed relatively quickly. In October 1945, 11 months after his capture, he was released. The journey home was long and difficult. Germany was in ruins. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure had collapsed. Millions of displaced people wandered roads, searching for homes and families. Hans walked much of the distance, his legs still occasionally aching from the old wound. He passed through devastated landscapes that bore no resemblance to the country he remembered. The Germany he had fought for no longer existed, replaced by something broken and defeated. When Hans finally reached his village in November 1945, he found his mother and sister living in their damaged but still standing house. The reunion was tearful and overwhelming. His mother had believed him dead. No word had reached her for months. When Hans walked through the door, thin and exhausted but alive, she collapsed in tears. They held each other for a long time, unable to speak. In the months that followed, Hans struggled to adjust to civilian life. The village was scarred by war, homes destroyed, families shattered, men missing or dead. Food was scarce. Work was scarce. Hope was scarce. Germany faced occupation, poverty, and the collective shame of what the Nazi regime had done. Hans, like millions of other returning soldiers, had to confront not just the trauma of war but the revelation of the Holocaust and other atrocities committed in Germany's name. Hans's response was to remain silent. He didn't discuss his military service except in the vaguest terms. He didn't attend veterans' gatherings where former soldiers told war stories and reminisced about battles. He kept his diary hidden, showing it to no one. The experience of mercy he had received felt private, almost sacred, too precious to share with people who might not understand or believe. But silence became isolation. Hans found it difficult to connect with others who hadn't experienced what he had. They spoke of Germans as victims, of suffering under occupation, of lost glory. Hans couldn't participate in those conversations. He had seen the enemy up close and found them humane. He had been saved by people he had been taught to hate. He knew that German soldiers had received mercy while German leaders had shown none. The contradiction haunted him. In 1951, Hans made a decision that shocked his family and community. He applied to immigrate to the United States. The process was complicated. Ex-Wehrmacht soldiers faced scrutiny and suspicion. But Hans persisted, writing essays explaining his desire to build a new life in America, submitting to interviews and background checks, demonstrating that he had never been a Nazi Party member or participated in war crimes. His youth and obvious sincerity helped. In 1952, he received permission to immigrate. Arriving in New York in spring 1952, Hans carried little more than a suitcase and his diary. He knew no one, spoke limited English, and had minimal job skills beyond what the Wehrmacht had taught him. But he had determination and a conviction that America, the country whose soldiers had saved his life, represented a chance to start over, to build something better than what he had left behind. Hans settled in a small town in Pennsylvania where other German immigrants had established a community. He found work in a factory, learned English through evening classes, and slowly built a life. He married a German-American woman named Anna in 1954. They had 3 children. Hans worked hard, saved money, eventually opened a small business. To his neighbors and friends, he was simply Hans Dietrich, a German immigrant who had made good. Few knew he had fought in the war. Fewer still knew what had happened to him. But Hans never forgot. He kept his diary, the notebook Nurse Helen had given him, in a drawer in his bedroom. Occasionally, he would take it out and read his own words from decades earlier, the confused, grateful observations of a young soldier who had expected death and received mercy instead. The diary became a talisman, a reminder of the person he had been and the person he had become. In the 1960s and 1970s, as his children grew, Hans began cautiously sharing his story. He told them about the war, about his capture,